Tucker Bryant's keynote to a powerful reflections from our community leaders. Today has reminded us of the incredible impact the Alamo Colleges District has made in the community for over 80 years, and even greater possibilities ahead. As we continue our convocation, the next session is especially important. We know that we are teaching and leading in times of change, where questions of academic expression are more vital than ever. Our goal is to ensure that faculty and staff feel informed, prepared, and confident in navigating these evolving conversations and contexts. We are fortunate to have with us Dr. Leila Brahmer, an expert in dialogue and academic expression, who will guide us through this timely workshop. I'm going to introduce her. Dr. Leila Brahmer is a director of curriculum for the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression at the University of Chicago. She studies and builds frameworks in which organizations and community members understand issues from multiple perspectives and work together to develop evidence-based approaches. She established a nationally recognized civic learning and engagement curriculum and a community-based public deliberation and dialogue program. At the University of Chicago, she works with high schools, colleges, educational organizations, and civic leaders to develop curricula and programming for productivity engaging about and with and across differences and disagreements. We are fortunate to have her and invite you to engage with her deeply as we take away these tools and insights that will strengthen not only your classrooms and your roles in Alamo Colleges, but we also want the shared commitment as to foster understanding and growth in our colleges. Please help me welcome Dr. Leila Brahmer.
Thank you, Carmen. Hello, everyone. It is absolutely my pleasure to be with you today. I have been here a couple times, and every time I come, my colleagues are worried I'm not going to come home because I'm so inspired by everything that you are doing here. And so I really am coming with a lot of humility I'm talking to a bunch of people who are really great teachers and doing really exceptional work with students in the classroom. What I want to provide is maybe a little tweak on that and how we translate what's happening in the classroom for students so they can take it with them into their personal and professional lives and their ability to communicate about with and across difference and disagreement. So today I want to start with this. Everyone, when I travel, I was talking to people on the plane yesterday, and they ask me what I do, and I tell them it's public discourse and how we navigate difference and disagreement, and people are saying, well, this is a really big problem now. It is indeed a big problem now. In 2018, I came to the University of Chicago, and people were like, oh, this is the most important moment ever. And it seems like every month that I've been there since 2018, that moment becomes more and more and more important. So, but John Dewey's talking about this nearly 100 years ago. And he was right about three things. One, and it's a really key piece, the problem isn't the public. So we often blame the public for how things go wrong. It's not the problem of the public, but it is the public's problem. They are not the cause of it, too. It is the most significant thing that is facing us in our personal, professional, and civic lives. This problem of discourse. We cannot solve any of the other issues without it, and so we need to do something about it. And three, we can actually improve it, and it's the modes that lead us down the bad path, not the people. So keep that in mind, because that's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to actually start today with a little bit on freedom of expression because, again, it has been one of those issues when I took the job in 2018 that has become more and more and more important. So I really do want to put a frame on that. And then I do want to talk about discourse. I think we misunderstand what it means and how we actually know how to do it well. And we can reclaim some of those ways of doing it well. And then I want to end with some classroom practices. I was going to do a much more interactive workshop, but we're not necessarily in a space to do a true interactive workshop. But I'm hopefully going to build in some questions and some things you can work through, give you some practices, and I want to leave some time for questions and challenges and engagement as well. So, first, my work at the University of Chicago is really thinking about if we're going to do this well, if we're going to prepare our students for the world, and their ability to do and bring these skills, these capacities of engaging about with and across difference and disagreement, we need to integrate it into everything. It cannot live in one program, it cannot live in one class, it cannot live in one space on campus. It has to be every touch with students. And so my work is really building out that integrative model from admission, through orientation, into the curriculum, into co-curricular activities, into every space that students occupy, so they eventually, imagine in 2 years, they eventually become the leaders who are modeling this for new students that are coming in. And I really do think you can make that kind of change on a college campus. So that is my work, and I can talk more about that and the challenges of doing so at a very diffuse, decentralized campus. You have some real advantages in the fact that you are much more centralized and much more in touch with people who work across different places of the university. So, my work in free expression is the practices. Certainly the University of Chicago has some principles and some policies, and I do want to talk a little bit about the Chicago tradition, since there are some principles and policies at the University of Chicago that get talked about a lot, particularly in the last couple years. So first, frankly, when I started in 2018, I rarely mentioned the Calvin Report. It has become really, really important. The Calvin Report is institutional neutrality. Since October 2023, I think it's up to almost 300 colleges and universities across the world have adopted some form of institutional neutrality, this idea that the institution doesn't take stands. So it's 1967 at the University of Chicago. The question is the Vietnam War. You can imagine that's the question of the day. The president asks Harry Calvin, First Amendment lawyer, and says, what should we do? Should we take stands? And the report comes back and says, no. That the university itself is a host of critics. And if the university were to take a stand, it would potentially influence the critics. So the student and the faculty are the people who take political and social action, not the university. Of course, there is an obligation clause. People talk about it as an exception clause. It's an obligation clause. The university is obligated to do so when it is at the heart of its mission, the mission of education. So anything that influences the educational or research mission, then the university does take political and social action. So example, earlier this year, the University of Chicago joined the National Institutes of Health lawsuit. University of Chicago has a medical center that serves the south side of Chicago, and many of the grants that were being flagged and canceled influence their work with the population that they're serving on the south side of Chicago. So that would be an example of an obligation in the obligation clause. Second, the Chicago principles. I think we're up to 400 people, institutions have adopted the Chicago principles. It is the notion of free inquiry. One takeaway that I always like to talk to students about it, no matter how wrong-headed it is, you have a right to say it in the quad. And that is the idea of the quad being that place. Residential halls are different, classrooms are different, right? But the idea of First Amendment free expression in the quad. With these, we have this, the principles and policies. My work at the University of Chicago since 2018 is to be thinking about the practices. How do we practice this well? How do we prepare our students to be the critics? And I can't do that without the purposes. So let me spend a little bit of time about why free expression is a key academic and civic value. I want to start with Mill. Why do we seek and engage difference and disagreement? We do it because, one, we might be wrong. Two, if we are right, and I spend a lot of time with student activists on this, if you are right, then you need to know why people disagree, why they object, why they hesitate, what they don't understand about your message, because if you don't do that, you will not be successful in advocating. You have to know what the playbook of the other team is, or you can't take the field, and take the field well. 3, if you don't keep talking about the values that are important, they have a possibility of becoming dead dogma. And I think about civil rights, I think about free expression as places where we have not kept them in the public eye. We haven't continued to talk about them. We haven't continued to teach about them in ways that I think would help people, would help them not be as vulnerable as they seem to have become. I want to pop across the pond. Frederick Douglass is talking about some of these same ideas at about the same time. For me, Frederick Douglass, I think, is one of our greatest American thinkers. He's giving this speech in 1860 in Boston. There's been a drunk mob that has disrupted an anti-slavery convention. Again, when I'm talking to students, I want to put this point and flag in this. 1860, Boston, Massachusetts, a drunken mob disrupting an anti-slavery convention. It puts a piece on history for them. And Frederick Douglass makes a full-throated defense of the First Amendment and how we need, I could choose the entire speech to put up here, but I want to put this piece. He's said something here that no one ever said in quite as clear terms, that there's a public audience. For Mill and others, as free expression has been the testing of ideas against an other, for Frederick Douglass, there's an audience that's going to adjudicate this and make some decisions and come to public consensus about ideas. And we better be aware of that public out there when we're thinking about how we say things, but also when we're thinking about who might be violated if we violate free expression. For me, I like to bring it home with 2 last slides. One is Hannah Gray. We just had her at our Academic Freedom Institute this summer. She's 95 years old and smarter than the collectivity of everyone that is in the room. But this is key. This is this space of discomfort where we develop our best thoughts. We aren't unsafe. It feels unsafe, right? But it's that place where we have that cognitive dissonance, where someone says something that challenges us, and they do in a way that is consequential, that we have to take it seriously. And it challenges us to do one of 2 things. We either refine our idea and make it stronger, or we develop a better argument. Both of those are the creation of knowledge. And that's the knowledge that we're helping students be able to create for themselves, not just in an academic setting, but in their personal lives. That place of challenge, that a place that asks you for intellectual responses to refine or make a better argument. And that's what we're preparing them to do, and it feels unsafe. But if we can teach them how to get through that, we make them a wicked force in their personal and professional lives. And finally, to bring this home on what are the purposes of free expression, this gets lost in the Chicago Principles, but it says that we do our best work, not alone, but in a community of personal and mutual respect. And that is, for me, a goal that we're working for on campus. So yes, students, you can imagine, are like, the freedom of expression is for the bad people who say horrible things. That's what the Chicago Principles are for. And me, the Chicago Principles are for all of us. And they're for us to be able to claim territory and say that this is a campus that does work this way, and we're going to demand good thinking, and you're going to have to make an argument. So if you say something wrong-headed, you're going to get questioned. We're not going to let it stand. And that is creating that academic community on campus. And I see this as my primary move that I'm trying to make, is have students, rather than sit back and accept the Chicago Principles and the bad actor, to stand up and say, yeah, free expression for all of us. And that means I'm going to stand up and walk in and say something when something is wrong-headed or offensive. So if that's what we're after, then really free expression is not this individual right that we keep talking about it as. It's a communal value in an academic campus. It's a communal value in our democracy. And that means we need to be able to do two things. And this is what I'm training the capacities for students to do. One, seek and engage difference and disagreement. That requires that I need to have intellectual curiosity. It requires that I need to be humble. I might be wrong, or not quite all the way right. And I'm going to get to that in a second. I don't think we're completely wrong, but we're not all the way right. It requires a generosity, which I'm going to get to in a second. Sorry, it demands a courage. And not just the courage to speak, but the courage to sit down and listen when somebody disagrees with you, to actually seek that out, because it's going to make you a better thinker and make your arguments stronger. And finally, it requires that generosity. Language is an imperfect tool used by imperfect beings. We come from multiple linguistic communities. We're going to say things. We're going to step in things. We're going to get things wrong. And so generosity to yourselves and others of asking rather than deciding that people are bad because they've messed up on a bad day. Second one. This is one I don't see people talking about. But it's this role that we have, each of us, when we enter into conversations, can change how that conversation goes. And we can be agents of facilitating the multiple perspectives. We can open discursive space. My good thinking colleagues, and especially students, challenge me on this about power. Absolutely. The people who have more power might have more power in creating that discursive space, but you can, in your own actions, start to shift it or to challenge it and make discursive space more open. So I really, when I'm working with students, I'm really trying to see them as agents that can really flip this. This, to me, is that translation. How do you translate what's happening in the classroom? You translate it into all the spaces you occupy so that you are an agent of opening space. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So here's where students will challenge me right away, and faculty colleagues. They're like, but what about this? You seem to have forgot that this is where we live on issues. Yes, John Dewey, I get it. We live on issues like that, but the answer is we know how to do this. Let me give you two examples here. Khan Academy has started in their schoolhouse program these conversations between pre-college students from across the country. And they survey them first, and they find people, they pair people together who have very different beliefs on very controversial issues, gun control, abortion, you name, whatever is our key issue in the country. These are pre-college students. They pair them together on Zoom, and they have conversations about the most controversial issues in our country, and they absolutely do not agree with them when they enter the room. And the goal of the conversation is not to convince somebody to agree with you, because, well, we can talk about that. I'm a rhetorician. If you want to ask me why that would be a bad idea, we can talk about that. They get together. They've been doing this for over a year now. They've never had one go badly. I have more data from another organization that does this with college students, Unified America. They have something they call College Bowl. I think it's poorly named, but they pair people across, college students across country on the most controversial issues in our society, people who disagree with each other. They, last time I saw their data, 18,000 conversations and only 3 went off the rails. So we worry about this and this, but the truth is we can do it. And we can do it in a Zoom classroom, or in a Zoom room with complete strangers. Somebody's like, it's easier with strangers. Is it? I don't know. It may be, but we actually can do it. What is the thing that they do that makes that different? They create a vessel, and they create a structured conversation. It is not entering into the Zoom room with, you believe this on abortion and you believe this other thing on abortion, go. Because if they did the go, it looks like this. They structure them through questions to each other, and the results are learning. And students universally report that they learned something about the other side. And we're doing that work in our classrooms all the time. How do we translate that then into the real world? Well, guess what? We have a process. This is the process they use. I didn't come up with this. They didn't come up with this. This is the process of academic inquiry. This is what we teach students all the time. They come into a class, we enter them in to understand base concepts. We put some texts in conversation where they might disagree with each other. We then work them through so that they have to work through that answer and come to something that would be their own argument. They have to make an argument for it. They have to present it. If I had a laser, rinse and repeat, right? This never ends. We're always in this process of academic inquiry. And we can do a better job of helping students understand that this is how we enter into issues. And if I could make this a 3D piece, for me, my puzzle, this would be 80%. We spend 80% of the time understanding and always deepening our understanding. What do you see? Shout it out. Face. Face. Liar. I'm always happy when there's somebody who's like liar and says it really like that. Liar, right? So it's face, it's liar. Yeah, turn your head a little bit. Which one's right? So if I say face, am I right? Am I? That's that kind of thing that I'm almost right. I'm right, but I'm not completely right. I use this a lot for students. What we see isn't wrong, but if I go into a community issue, or if I write a paper, or if I'm working with my spouse on something, and I'm just face, 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 and not seeing liar, am I going to be successful? No. It is that idea of becoming more right by asking other people, and it's that process of getting students beyond a reaction, face, to getting into communities and asking questions so that they can deepen their understanding and come up with a better response to be more closely aligned with what might be right. So once we do this, we can move off of this continuum. Because once I go into society and I ask what they see, I can move off of this continuum and gather multiple perspectives. I had a young man in one of my sessions, he was 8 years old, who told me it was a bug, and he came up and showed me how it was a bug, right? Multiple perspectives, some might be more right, some might be less right, but we can literally gather multiple perspectives and come to better conclusions and open discourse. And that's the opening. I might see face, but to hold it loosely while I ask the rest of you what you see, so that I can gather all the multiple perspectives and come to a better conclusion. We understand when I'm working with communities that are divided, if I can get a divided community to start listening to the multiple perspectives that are out there, they start to examine and test ideas, and eventually, quite quickly, they learn to collaborating and creating. And for those of you in the classroom, every time we can get our students collaborating and creating, you know what happens. Energy, right? It all of a sudden gets really loud and lots of things are going around, and we love as humans to live in the space of collaborating and creating. Then they present, rinse, repeat. So I promised you a problem. The problem is we enter in with face, so let's go back. We're going to enter in with face, and once I enter in with that opinion, I'm no longer listening to liar. I'm actually going to tell liar she's a liar. And there's some really good evidence about this. I made a mistake years ago, and I had a middle school student show me how it was face, and she would never believe it was liar. She's like, oh, well, yeah, I could see that, but it's not liar, it's really face. Once we make a positive argument for something, it's really hard for us to back off of it. So I always think about our students come to us, so many with this, they've been taught to write an argument by choose something you believe in, find some evidence for it, find out what the other side believes, right? Find some evidence for that, and then come to your conclusion. Well, they've already come to the conclusion. It's a fake exercise. You know who's really good at writing that paper? ChatGPT. AI is really good at find something you believe in, you know. They've already come to the opinion. They're not actually doing this work. And so if we can move it, when we do this, we often enter into the two-sided debate. We've already decided their sides. We're not interested in multiple perspectives. And it ends like this. And I study debate. I used to run a nationally recognized debate team. I get it, but two-sided debate, especially in the free range, ends up like this. So when people ask me about our political and partisan divide, I'm not surprised. That's how we've chosen to do public discourse. If you choose a different format for it, you come up with different results. It's also not good for us. I keep making the argument, oh, I might as well make it. I'm going to be provocative. It's killing us. And we do it in our personal lives. It's our default method. I promise you there are better ways of engaging. And we know them because we use them all the time in academic inquiry. We also, I think it has something to do with this. If I had my phone, I'd wave it. That has something to do with that as well. And this is a problem. We have decided this is the valence for the issue that we're dealing with. And once we've decided that, people will argue, well, if we argue about it, we'll find the truth in between. Is that true? I don't think so. I don't think the truth is in between. I think the truth is out here, and often in our personal and professional and civic disputes, we've artificially decided that that's the valence, and there's something else happening. I was reading an article this morning about someone, I can't even remember where it was in, but he was making an argument that most couples argue about. It's true, most couples have the continual argument, but they're not actually arguing about it anymore, doing the dishes, the shoes, right? And it's because we've decided that's the valence, when the real issue is out there if we were to explore it and we could actually come to some conclusions. And when I'm talking to civic leaders, by doing this, we've lost all the other pieces out there. And so civic leaders are like, why don't people come to our meetings? Only the cranks come. Well, only the cranks come because it's that. And Flamingo's not showing up because no one's listening to Flamingo because Flamingo's not even on that continuum. This, when we do it, and let's hold a little loosely to the oxytocin, but there's some research coming out that we actually are creating some good counter chemicals to the cortisone when we engage in this type of piece. When we can have students, and I wish Schoolhouse and this other piece would do some actual research on this that would look at this, but we can do it in the laboratory. When people engage in conversations about difference and they ask questions, they self-report well-being, and it's sticky. It sticks around for about 2 weeks, these well-being things that have increased in how they feel about the world and their place in it. And we are getting some really good brainwave research that shows that people really enjoy this type of engagement. Yes, we are hardwired for that. I think we're just as hardwired for this, and we haven't had a chance to engage in it. We wouldn't be on this planet 150,000 years later if we weren't able to connect and create. And I worry when we have that divisive discourse that we have lost our ability or losing our ability to connect and create. And again, I could wave my phone on that one. So how do we do this? How do we take what we know that functions well to create knowledge, bring us together, create some well-being piece, do it in the classroom and translate it for our students so they can use it in their personal and professional life? This is what I propose, is this idea of how can we do this? We need to be able to establish an academic community. We need to center that process of understanding rather than the process of division. We can use open prompts, engaged listening, and scaffolding advocacy. I'm going to run through these. I do think there's something here in course design and materials, but that's a little bit longer piece about how you do that. But let's talk about the expectations of what we're going to do in the classroom. I start on the first day by telling students what we're going to do is disagree. Because the only way to create knowledge, the only way to create knowledge is to be challenged and always be testing how right I am and making myself closer to that right. And to engage with the people who disagree with me so I can make a better argument when I am right. And that requires that I need to prioritize listening and close reading. That is all we're going to do in this class. We're going to learn how to listen to each other, and we're going to close read texts. We're not going to put our own viewpoints on those texts, because that's what will result in us making our strongest arguments in the world. And then I have to clarify grading on that. That if we're having class discussion, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. And what I'm trying to get away from are the quick and the confident, right? They raise their hands before anyone, before I even finish the answer. I know you have the quick and the confident, right? And they get to set the agenda for almost every class. And then other people check out. I hear this from high school students all the time. This is a really good example of leveling discursive space. High school students tell me that there's 2 people in every class that set the agenda every day, and there's nothing for them to do. And when they talk to their teachers about that, their teachers say, marketplace of ideas, you need to get your hand up. Really? I used to say this too, so when I was a young teacher, I did say, yeah, marketplace of ideas, get your hand up. Really? I have then created I've created a monopoly, right? And the people that might take more than a nanosecond to think of a response, I've lost them. And they probably have better responses than the quick and the confident who are trained to raise their hand and say whatever comes to their mind first and not test it. So it's the quantity over quality over quantity, and then it's really baking into that silence. You're going to sit with the question. We're going to write a little bit about it. Then we're going to have everyone in the class respond to it. And for the quick and the confident, I say the best learning for you is to learn when you have something to say versus just saying. I did a high school workshop this summer, and I had a young woman who spent the first 2 days with her hand up constantly. Even when she answered a question, she never took it down because she wanted to be called on to respond to herself. And so finally I was like, well, I thought she would learn. No. And it looks uncomfortable. And everybody looks at her. It's like, well, why don't you call on her? And I said, we've had a conversation. I'm not calling her again. I rarely have to do this, but I had to give her, it's like, you get 3 chances this morning to say something. I want you to spend that well. Think of it as 3 chips. You're going to spend the chips when you have something really, really important to say. And it's going to, you know what? It's going to make you uncomfortable. It's going to be good for you. Learn about it. And by the way, she didn't learn really well, but at the end she said, I'm going to try this when I get home. I think her teachers are going to like that, right? That she's had some time to think about this and becoming more responsive. I also noted that it would be good, she could earn more chips if she entered in with a question rather than a declarative statement, right? So this idea of trying to retrain some bad behavior, that's not going to serve her well in the world. So, how do I get that to be an agent of change on that? The second piece on this is creating the vessel. And for me, that starts with the introductions. I even did this at the Academic Freedom Institute this summer. It's so cool how you can create norms of discourse. So I had academic leaders, faculty, administrators in the room, 42 of them. We had to do introductions. And I had to get them done in 20 minutes. I know what you're thinking, not possible, right? Everyone told me it wasn't possible. It is indeed, I made it happen. I was a little worried too. 10 words. You are going to say your name, where you are, your title. Okay, that's already a lot of minutes, right? And then the next thing is what concerns you about academic freedom in our current climate. And you get 10 words on that. and we went around the room, and we got it done in 20 minutes. We also got a lot of information out there, right, that we could digest later. And the best thing about it is it created a norm that the rest of the time, people talked in really brief statements. No one in that room went on the long pitch that you would expect they did. We had 2 people who came late, and that's where you could see it, because they came late and they weren't part of the norm. They did the normal faculty administrator thing where they talked all the time. And I had to pull them aside and say, you know, we had a little bit of norm setting about how we were going to do this. And they're like, oh, I was wondering why people were so concise in their answers. You can do this with students as well. You create the space with norming, and you don't tell them that's what you're doing. Discourse is powerful in doing that. I also believe in developing the course agreements together. My first day of class, if I have a class that's going to be class discussion, we create the agreements. But it's not the normal agreements of, well, you put students on creating agreements and they're like, we're all going to talk only for 45 seconds. I'm like, well, who's enforcing that, right? How do you create agreements? For me, I create agreements by doing, having them really think about why we need agreements. What do I need in order to fully participate in this class and have my voice out there? What would it require of me, my colleagues, my peers, and what would it require of me, the instructor? Having them write that in advance, and they come to class ready for it. I also, when I'm creating meetings, I've been called in a couple times to help people. It's like, we're going to have this planning group. Can you help us set some norms? For planning groups, I do this too. What will it require for us to do our work well? And we're going to set those norms together. I do that with individual writing. We do that then in small group discussion. And then we do a large group discussion where we actually create those agreements of how we're going to work together. It is really cool. Students are really quite honest. Usually the people who raise their hands all the time are really thinking about it, and they're like, well, I need to sit back and listen, or maybe I need to ask more questions. And they're working through this problem together. And by the end of the first day, actually I can do this exercise in about 30 minutes. By the end of 30 minutes, I've actually modeled how we're going to do class. This is literally what we're going to do every day. We're going to gather everybody's ideas, we're going to work through everybody's ideas, and we're going to bring them to a large group discussion where we're going to come to some conclusions together. And this then allows me to always move back to it if something goes wrong, right? And isn't that the concern, that it will go wrong and somebody will say something horrible? I have this that we can move back to. I will tell you, in my teaching in the quarter in the semester, it has rarely happened, but when I've taken students abroad, it almost always happens that something goes wrong. And so it's really good to have co-created agreements that we can return to and reevaluate. Then we can move to the idea of open questions. So how do you ask an open question that allows for that collaborative thinking? For me, I'm always, and I put this, don't have the laser. I put this piece in the corner. I start my class every day like that. It's not as easy when I can't have them in a circle, but every day each person has to respond to an open prompt. I often give it to them in advance, particularly in the first 3 weeks. I grew up shy and had a speech impediment, so this would have scared the heck out of me when I was an 18-year-old, but it's important that I needed to develop that skill set, right? So moving around the room, and it's always a question that's about uncertainty or has a multiple way of thinking about it. So what's the nature of our current political discourse? What concerns you about our political discourse? How do you see this issue that we're facing? It's never how do you feel about, but always thinking about how do we open and do that. By the time they get a little bit further in, I give them creative prompts. The dean has asked us to prepare a statement about this and about our class. Let's create that collective piece. And then by the time they get into class, I can also ask them, here's what we've been asked to do. How do you suggest we do it? Even in my, I only had students 4 days, pre-college students. By the third day, I could give them a prompt and like, here's what I want you to complete by the end of the day. How should we do it? And they worked through the problem of how could we open discourse and ensure that everyone had a chance to speak and we were using our best thinking. I also want to always get away from certainty. My colleagues in the sciences, when I'm telling them about the problems with climate change discourse and their problem with not being able to say that we're 100% certain, my colleagues in the sciences are right about certainty, that we can't get to the complete certainty. So how about we have a little bit of humility and curiosity and move our students from the declarative of knowing and what do you know into seeing education more as what kind of questions can you ask. So much of their training in an educational system has been about being right rather than asking questions. So how do we get them to flip the strip and say that education's actually about asking the questions and not knowing the answers? And asking more questions so you can get closer and closer and closer to the answers. So, my first 3 weeks of class always start with what don't you understand about the reading. I always teach a couple times a year with the Warrior Scholar Project, and I had them in, I always teach a section that has the Constitution and Federalist 10. And I start the class with, what don't you understand about Federalist 10? What is the question that remains for you? And let's start there, and then let's dig into Federalist 10 and how Madison creates a really well-structured argument to move through a process. And always their questions are pegged along that process. And then every class period, ensuring that at least, my goal is always 3 times, that each person gets a chance to have their voice in the room 3 times. It's tough. I did a smaller segment this summer with 50 students. It was really difficult. But I wanted every one of the 50 students to have their voice in the room at least once every session we were together. That idea of ownership and voice and being valued. And then for me in small groups, I almost always never do pairs. Pairs all have a tendency to either get into we all agree or a binary. Small groups stretch that, and of at least 3 start to stretch that. And of course, in their small groups, same process of going around and having each person answer the question. So, if I were going to think about a practice for engaged listening, and we aren't in necessarily a workshop where we can engage in quite the same way, I would ask a question, should institutions ban the use of AI? Good question? No? It seems like a setup when I asked it that way, right? I'm going to say not a great question. By the way, I stole this one from a faculty meeting. One of my former colleagues called me and it's like, oh, we had the worst discussion at our faculty meeting and we started with this question, what went wrong? And I'm like, well, it's the question. When I asked, should institutions ban the use of AI, which was their question, should the college ban the use of AI? It's a yes, no. But if you're a yes, there are multiple reasons why you're a yes. And if you're a no, there are multiple reasons why you're a no. And I've defined a debate that's maybe not the debate. There's a much more interesting discussion to be had. I gave that feedback, and then they came back with me with this one. What if we did this? And I'm like, no, still the same problem. Multiple reasons for being yes, multiple reasons for being no. We've created it as a should when we aren't even ready to think about what the issue is. So how do we think about what the issue is? thinking about open inquiry and prompts. So I gave them an exercise of thinking about attendance, right? So should everyone be required to go to class? These are 3, I think, better questions. By the way, these weren't even, this was me on an email, so I just copied this from my email, a quick email. There are even better questions to ask that would get us to explore this issue more fully before we decided it was time to make a decision. And this is the thing, remember open inquiry, that academic inquiry, let's understand first before we decide where the decision points are. And so moving back to the multiple viewpoints to decide what it is we're actually dealing with. So for AI, this seems to be a better question. How has AI changed the way that you have formatted your assignments? I also suggested for them that they engage in a process of engaged listening. So rather than have it as a faculty discussion where people come to the mic, which I think is the worst way of doing business in our democracy and in faculty governance, is an open mic, because you're only going to keep inviting the same people forward, meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. And I say this, the reason my colleagues were consulting me is I had been faculty senate chair a couple of times, and they're like, you did this thing where everyone shared. How did you do that? Well, I did it this way. We sat at tables, or we got into groups of 3s, and we did a process that I call engaged listening, where each person, I give this to assignments to my students all the time, listen to understand. So ask people about something, and then you have to ask at least 3 questions to understand that point of view better. And they have to be open-ended questions. And you have to paraphrase until you get it right. And once you get it right, well, I practice this all the time when I'm traveling or if I'm, oh, sure. I'll give you an example since we can't go through the exercise in quite the same way. Here's the example. Which one? I gave a keynote in downtown Chicago for a student model UN conference, and it was cold, and I had to wait for the bus, and I decided I would get a beer at a bar before I waited for the bus, and Peter Frampton was in town, and there's a guy from Indiana at the bar for Peter Frampton, and thank goodness I'm in an audience, I don't have to explain who Peter Frampton is, so at least as much as I normally do. And we got to talking, right? And he's like, oh, this conversation with you makes me feel so much better because I was really worried about coming to Chicago because it's so liberal, and my friends told me I was going to get shot coming to this I'm like, okay, let's talk through that. And I said, what really concerns you about all the liberals? And he decided we were going to talk about reproductive rights. And he's like, reproductive rights. For me, that's his language would have been a bright line on it. And 3 questions, right? I make this case to my students, I'm going to do it myself. So what's your viewpoint on reproductive rights? Why? And he told me this story on the why about something that happened to him as a young man. I asked more questions, and I got to a place of understanding on it. Are we still going to disagree? Yes. But I understand where he comes from, and I learned something from the exchange. On my other side, to the left, was a man in town from Pittsburgh for business, and he said, I just listened to this conversation. I want you to know I just totally disagree with the Frampton guy. And I'm like, okay. And he was in Frampton gear. And I said, so tell me about your viewpoint. And the coolest thing happened. The guy from Indiana took over the questioning. And he asked, I didn't even tell him what the process was. We're primates, we model, right? And he took over the questioning. And then at the end, they both were like, I really understand, I don't agree with you, but I really understand where you're coming from. And so that's this piece of we can have these conversations, even across real extreme divides, and a conversation that could have gone off the rails at any point. And I left them, They had moved on to other issues. I left them, but I left them with the idea that they would continue having these conversations because they'd learned how to do this. And so this idea of engaged listening, I said, you need to do this to do that understanding about this question of AI. So, wait, I went backwards. The question of AI, and instead, how about this? Because I bet everyone of faculty have thought about this, and they've either made changes or they haven't made changes. What were they? And if you can ask them then what the question is why, we can get at the concerns, rather than what concerns you about AI. And so I was going to have you do a little practice on this, but the idea would be if we did practice on this, we would get to a deeper clarity of where people are coming from and what the concerns are so that we could actually name what the issue is we're dealing with, and then we could move forward with AI. And just note, I can imagine what happened at this discussion about AI. There were a bunch of people who were like, well, it's too late, it's out of the, you're never going to stop it, right? So there was that valence. No, they're cheating, right? Yes, we need to ban it because they're cheating. No, because they're going to have to use it in the law. And all of this was going around, and they were never going to get to a decision because they hadn't actually defined the issues or understood the nature of the problem before they were moving to a decision. And I think we're forced that too often, and we're forcing our students into that same trap rather than giving them time to really think about it and what's going on with that. Assignments. For me, the same thing. Center the process. And it's always scaffolding. I love argument. Usually by this point, people are like, why does she hate argument so much? I love argument. I want students to make strong arguments. And in making strong arguments, they can only learn how to do that, I think, through the process of really understanding the issues that are out there, gathering multiple perspectives, working through that, and through doing that might come to some sort of unique view, but it's nuanced and interesting, and they've actually made a strong argument. This is also a really important point for me in free expression. I always tell students, and I really believe this, I do not care what you believe. I care that you can make an argument. So you're going to, in this class, at the end of the class, you're going to make arguments. Don't try to agree with me. Make a strong argument. Make me challenge so that I have to work through and actually either redefine my thinking or come up with a better argument. Challenge me. And I think that's one of the concerns people, I think it's a little bit of a straw person, one of the concerns people have is students writing to satisfy the professor. And I always tell them, yes, you can write to satisfy me. That's by challenging me. Make a strong argument. Also, by this time, people always say that I hate advocacy. It's what I do. It's why I entered into studying rhetoric years ago. But it's not this. And I will tell you, if you would have asked me at 30 years old, I would have told you that it looks like, that its advocacy looks like this. It's two-sided, it's debate. But it's not. The true advocacy, and the more we learn about how people are moved on issues, it is this process. This is the process by which we come to conclusions. And so if I want to move someone, I need to move them through this whole process. I was talking to rural students a month ago on climate change, and they're like, how would I make an argument about climate change in my hometown? This, you gotta move back to the understanding, not to climate change. First of all, you can't use that word, that phrase, and then you gotta go back to where people live. I am from rural South Dakota. I have never met somebody in a rural state that, well, that's not true. I've never met a farmer or a rancher in a rural state who doesn't see the influence of weather changes in the last 30 years. I'm not going to call it climate change, but boy, they understand something is happening, and they understand it fundamentally in a way that I don't. I can read all the science in the world. They fundamentally live it. How do I get to understand that so I can make a better argument and move them along a process where they can see that changes will be good for them as well? And so it's about picking them up in the village where they live, right? Speaking the language, getting them, and moving them up advocacy. I wish I could be Frederick Douglass and move people all the way up the mountaintop in one fell swoop. But really having students realize that advocacy is incremental, and we keep making arguments, and we keep making better arguments, and we keep moving people, and we can concert a public, and if we can concert a public, we can make change. And the only way to make change is by concerting a public. I think it's unfortunate that our students, that's not true, that that people see advocacy and social change in ways that are not as effective. I was just reading a conglomeration of research about social movements in the 20th century and 21st century through the year 2021. Only one has been successful. They all use the same tactics, but the success hasn't been there because everyone runs to Washington and people have forgotten to do the work where people live. So how do you get students back to where they live to do the work to concert a public? And by concerting a public is how any social movement that actually ended in what we might call as a gain has been effective. So I'm always trying to help students understand that gains take time, that we need to fight for them, and then we need to continue fighting for them. So if we take the Voting Rights Act, if we don't continue working on the Voting Rights Act, we slide right back down this path. It's that idea of dead dogma. And I feel like I've talked already too much. So I'm just going to go to questions. What questions do you have? Comments, challenges?
What do you think of some of the very public popularity of things like Jubilee entertainment that have tried to turn kind of discourse into theater?
Thank you for the question. So the question's about discourse into theater, Jubilee being one of them. One of my roles at the University of Chicago is I am now overseeing the student board, and they do their goal is 30 events every quarter, so that's a lot of events in a 9-week quarter now, right? But one of their ideas was we're going to do a Jubilee every week, and I'm like, no, it is indeed theater, and it's been fed by our information news, entertainment news ecosystem, right? So Fox and CNN have been doing that for years, of taking people on the extreme, getting them to yell at each other, getting them to be cuter, and how they yell at each other, and then people come and listen to it. I don't find a great deal of value in that. It's, when we look at was I smart? Yes. When we look at this divide, we always are worried about the people on the extremes and how they're being silenced. If I know what you think, I don't think you're being silenced. And if I can still hear you, I don't think you're being silenced. And I seem to know a lot about the people on the left and the right who are at that I know a lot about their viewpoints. I'm much more interested in the viewpoints that are out there, and they're not on that continuum. That's why I put Flamingo there, so we can all remember Flamingo. I'm much more interested in what Flamingo says or might think, and they make up, based on polling, about 70% of our electorate. I always tell my students to go talk to them. And every time I do this presentation to students, they always say, well, my aunt is and it's always somebody on the very far extreme of either extreme. How do I talk to her? And I'm like, about political issues, because she's wrong. And I'm like, well, one, entering into a conversation with someone to tell them they're wrong in the history of the world has never worked, right? So why are you doing that? Of course you're going to end up in this piece. Two, why don't you ask your aunt some questions? How she got to that belief, at least get to a better understanding of where she's coming from, and accept the fact that you're not going to necessarily change that belief unless it happens over time. But why are that's my thing with Jubilee. I think people's families are now into Jubilee. And we're just recreating it all over this terrible way of doing our politics. And the people who are silenced that we've lost are the people here in the middle that I think might have the most to say.
Do you have anything that you could share that could help us when we may not be in a, when time is always
Yep.
a challenge, and how we can take pieces of this design where you won't be able to provide it all in a same place, same time construct, but it might need to be iterative, and we might need to just choose
Yep.
pieces, so.
Yep. And I should note, I'm always doing that. I'm always building it over time. I realize some of you will have some class sizes that won't make this one be the one that you use, but I do think it's getting everybody's voice in the classroom every day. And having that first question that you might ask not be a question where somebody raises a hand at all. We're never, it's so interesting, by the third week there'll be, I'm like, we're not doing that. I'm gonna ask a question and I'm gonna start in a different space every day, and we're gonna go around and hear what everybody thinks, and then we're gonna make some decisions about what's most interesting to pursue for the whole of us. And that alone, that changes the nature of a classroom. It really levels, we can never have a level classroom, but it really levels the playing field for students. And it's an expectation that they know that they're gonna, so they read, right? They're gonna read because they're gonna be put in a position where they have to say something out of the box. So I think that's a good practice. If you have a larger piece, you can build in the Mentimeters, the other things that's not quite as much accountability as my own voice, but accountability. In the back. Oh, well, not the far back, middle back.
What strategies do you take to bridge the gap between what happens in the classroom and connecting with student services or student affairs so that they can kind of bridge over?
Oh, thank you for that question. So I'm not going to answer from my, well, I am sort of. I used to work at a small liberal arts college, which I think the structure is more like here, even though you're a large institution. There seems to be a much more seamless relationship between student affairs and faculty than there are, even at the University of Chicago, it's so siloed that faculty don't even talk across the divisions or departments. But it's really leaning into those relationships and thinking about how we can build this together. So tomorrow I have another meeting with Residential Life that's going to talk about our new core. So we have a new core class that's going to be doing a lot of this work, which will be piloted with a third of the class. And I'm going to talk about how do we take what's going on in that core class with academic inquiry and then build it into different places in the student body. So Residential Life being a key one. How do we think about residential halls being a place where students are spending a lot of time in the understanding? In a residential hall, they may have something that they might have to come to a decision on, but most of the time it's really getting to know the other people in the hall. And so can we really focus on understanding? On Wednesday, I'm going to talk to student leadership, and we'll spend a lot of time on how do we train student leaders to be, I'm going to use the word better student leaders so that they can create these kind of structures in their organizations as well. One of the problems with student leadership, and it's the same with any leadership in the world, is the person in charge, they're the president this year, sets an agenda, and I'm going to hopefully work with them to move back and start going around the circle and asking what other people want so that they can set an agenda together rather than a top-down agenda, it's a shared agenda, which I hope the research would tell you would increase student involvement in that organization. It's a win-win for everyone. Next week I'll be talking to students in wellness. It's unfortunate. We have this idea that free expression is at odds with diversity and inclusion, and with wellness, student wellness, but it's actually that idea of free expression, our own voice, and being able to own that and develop it is really a real big piece of student wellness. So working with them to think about how do they talk to students and work through issues. Does that get at your question? Yeah. It's all about partnerships. How do we build the partnerships that support students? I always make the argument that every person on campus, their only purpose on campus is to support student growth and learning, and we each do it in our own ways. So how do we partner and essentially raise the ship together? Other questions, challenges, thoughts? Go for it. Alternatives to certainty. Do you want to give me more on that one, or just go?
Intellectual humility, that kind of thing. You said, I think, was it curiosity? Is that what you said?
Curiosity and humility, yeah.
Okay. So how are we going to navigate that space? Not clinging to certainty. How are we going to?
So the alternatives to certainty. It takes a lot of time. And I would say that that's probably my primary thing that I'm doing in the first 2 weeks of any class. And when I have students for only 4 days, I really have to really double down in the first 2 hours. They are so trained at being certain. And we all are, right? We're very well trained to be certain on our responses. And so it really is to tell them that we're not going to be certain in this class. We're always going to be questioning, always going to be questioning, always going to be questioning so that we can deepen our thinking. It is counterculture, so it takes time. But I think I do it, I was talking earlier, one of the most, Aristotle said it, as well as others, the most effective way to persuade others is by enacting it, by essentially living it yourself. You tend to be the best persuader, and so I live it for them in my own uncertainty about whatever we're doing. And sometimes it's working them through the process, like reading Madison's 10 and telling them, the first time that I was reading Federalist 10 when I was in college, I was certain it was about this. And by the way, it's a really clear argument. He really walks people through, but it's like, it's much more going on. And every time I read it with students, I learn a little bit more. And always at the end of the day, I tell them what I learned. So the group of active duty and some vets, it's like, thank you. I had never thought about it this way, and thank you for adding that to the way I see it, right? And so really modeling for them how people learn and how you can continue to be uncertain about a text. It's difficult. I do another engagement with, we call them the veteran scholars, so they're military veterans who are coming to the University of Chicago, and we do an exercise, we do a 2-week session with them on discourse. How do you engage in class discussion? How do you write well, right? So some things that might not have been in their military training, they're bringing so much to us, but how do we prepare them to enter into the college classroom with writing and class discussion? And one of the pieces we read is from Marx. And invariably, they will come in and say Marx was wrong. How do you know Marx is wrong? I know Marx is wrong because look at the Soviet Union, it doesn't exist anymore. And I'm like, well, that's not Marx. We got to go to the text. And they're like, well, the text was really hard to understand. I'm like, okay, so let's start there. What don't we know about the text? Let's dig into the text. And we're going to really read it together and look at his argument. And I don't tell them that's at the beginning, but the piece we give them actually proves why he's wrong, in my view. So it's actually a piece that's like, it's where his reasoning falls off the track, but it's so good for them to read through, and they're like, oh yeah, that's right. yeah, he's right about, yep, is that not, yep, that's true about the world. And we worked through that whole problem to really build his argument, and I'm like, well, okay, now let's test it, and how does it not withstand some of that testing? But always going back to the text. What can we learn from the text? What still don't we know? How can we test the argument? And by the way, I always tell them, because I think this is true, if Marx were in the room with us testing it, I think he would learn something from us, right? He was a scholar. He would have taken away, like, okay, I need to make a better argument. You've really made me think about this. How's this going to work in 2025? Maybe not. Maybe I need to shore up my examples about the cows, right? But I think it's that sort of humility of modeling it for them, modeling the uncertainty. And obviously, I'm a humanist, where I think there's a great deal of uncertainty. I mean, people argue that we know nothing then because of it, right, as a humanist. But I always then have to point out my scientist friends who will never say anything for 100%, right? It's good to have that degree of uncertainty and that degree of what we as individual humans bring to something and bring to a conversation. And once they see the proof in the pudding, they love it. Yes?
I am interested in finding out when things go off the rails, what's next?
So I will say, it doesn't happen very often. I think in the real world, okay, let me work through it as a process. My students are always worried. I'm like, go out in the world and talk to people and find out how they're, just ask some questions. Like, what if they don't want to talk to me? And I'm like, well, that doesn't happen. All that. What if they yell at me? I'm like, that rarely happens. I am a clumsy person. I fall at least once a month. But yet here I am walking way too much back and forth across the stage, right? We got to pick ourselves up too. So there's one, I think we worry a lot about the going off the rails when it doesn't happen all that often. Two, I really believe if we can build the vessel and the process, we can really mitigate it going off the rails. It's part of how I sell this to Res Life. If we can create a vessel and a process, I believe we will have less conflict in residential life. That students will resolve things, start to be able to resolve things better for themselves without bringing in external people. So one, I don't think it happens that often. Two, if we bring the vessel and we build it with the process, I really think we mitigate it. Three, when it does happen, if I have a vessel and a process, I have a place we can come back to and resolve it together. So let me give you an example. In 2020, I taught 3 courses around the presidential election. So the presidential primary, which was unprecedented, the presidential election, which was unprecedented. And if you don't remember, we had that period where we didn't have a president, all right, where we were still counting votes. And then I did in 2021, I did the inaugural piece, because I'm like, well, at least I get to go to an inauguration. That's what I study, presidential, oops, that went a little bit off the rails, right? And I have students from, some of those classes online, I have students from a variety of different political perspectives, and some of them really deeply divided on the issue. We talked about the deepest issues. I think we did so with uncertainty. That's really hard to model in a political class, but with uncertainty and mutual respect and wanting to get to know each other. And we did not go off the rails, except once. In the primary class, it was when, oh, now I lost her name. Dropped out of the race. They all loved her. She did selfies. She has a dog. Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm playing Pyramid. Oh, sorry, you caught me. Friend of Bernie. Anyway, Elizabeth Warren, thank you. Elizabeth Warren, when she dropped out, what I did, think about the vessel I created. I had 48 students in that class right before COVID in this really small class. And the vessel I created for how we were going to do this presidential primary is each student chose to be on a team of one of the Democratic primary. There wasn't a Republican primary, and they were going to be communication experts, right? So you have to be on a true primary team. Each student chose to be on teams. They could be as large or as small as they were going to be. Actually, the Biden team only had one person, and somebody else felt bad for them and joined. And eventually, they all had to get on the Biden team. And then when your team failed, you had to make a letter to apply for the other campaign team, right? So a real live, this is what it's like, campaign communication is fast, it's furious. You got to write a text, we're going to tweet, right? When Elizabeth Warren dropped out, one of the young men, someone said something, it's like, well, we've been saying for weeks that our campaign wasn't very good. True, it had a flaw in it. And this young man was so hurt by her dropping out that he just lashed out at everybody in the classroom. And it was not a great moment, right? And I think one of the things that I had built into the class was pause for silence. And we paused. And I asked him, I said, Nate, do you need to leave or would you like to work through this? And he said, I think I need to sit and work through this with my colleagues. And so we got in our best circle and worked through it and worked through his feelings. I hadn't done that check-in. Nate was smart about that. I hadn't done the check-in on how they were going to feel about this. We were gamified it too much, right? And so we went around the room about how we felt about the primary and where we were all sitting with it, as everything was consolidating down to Biden. And we had a teary-eyed share session, but we held it together, and we held, it worked. This summer, I had a young woman, and you can imagine being together and you're away from home and you're 15 is a little difficult. And one day in class, she just broke down in tears. And again, Hannah, should we take a moment? And she said, no, I think I need to tell people why this is so stressful for me. And she shared why the whole thing was so stressful for her. She was from a small town in Iowa. She goes, I'm just used to being the smartest person in my class, and now I'm with a whole group of people who are really smart. And I'm like, let's talk about it. I will also say in that class, if you're asking for the more traditional going off the rails, in that class there were two young men who disagreed with each other vehemently, and every discussion they tried to turn into a disagreeing with each other vehemently. And we're like, we're not doing that here. Here's what we're doing together. And I did something, I did something that I maybe shouldn't have done. I had those two who were yelling all the time. I had the young woman who never put her hand down. I had another woman who always wanted to be talking, but she never raised her hand and was always whispering. I put them all together in a small group. And my co-teacher's like, what are you doing? Why don't you put them and distribute them? You know what happens if I distribute them? All their bad acting goes together. It was terrible. Our first morning together, I finally had to move them to their own room because they were so loud and they were yelling at each other. I had to send my co-teacher in to moderate them. And then the next morning they were coming back, and I had made a decision overnight. I'm like, I'm just going to sit with them. I don't think they can do this. I'm going to sit with them. I made this problem. I'm going to resolve it. And they came back in, and it's like we had a talk in the residential hall lounge last night, and we made rules for ourselves, and we are going to work through this together. And I was like, do you want me to sit? And it's like, no, we will call you in if we need. And they worked through it, and they had this whole thing of giving people time out when they were, that's not what I would have done, but they worked through it, and they went from doing the worst work you've ever seen on the third day of class to the fourth day of class. They gave the best presentation because everything was tested and tried and worked out, and they developed a way of working through each other. And I think we have this idea that we have to separate people. If you have a bunch of A girls, put them in the same group together. If you have a bunch of slackers, I learned this years ago, put the slackers in a group together. They will rise to the occasion. They're used to depending on other people. And so discourse is really powerful. That went off the rails, but fortunately, they resolved it themselves, and I think it's because we had created a process, right? And they also saw what their peers were doing, that they wanted to rise up and do something better. I wasn't sure I was going to get through that one, though. I was going to end with this, but kind of a thought of how you might, what you're bringing back with you. But also, if you have any questions or comments or challenges, you know where to find me. Send them to me. I'm happy to engage in the conversation. And seriously, thank you for all the work that you do with students and what I report to my colleagues as you are doing some of the best work that I've seen in the country. So thank you for all that you do. And I am landing the plane just in time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brommer. Can we give her one more hand of applause, please? I think she took the clicker. So I'm going to turn the time over to Ross Lovehead, our General Counsel for Alamo Colleges. Thank you so much. I thought I had a little slide for you, but let's see if I do. Oh, there he is. Oh, don't forget your phone. Ross is a San Antonio native. He has served as General Counsel in the District Office for Legal Services for 13 years. And he graduated with high honors from the University of Texas at Austin. Woohoo, go Longhorns. He has practiced law since 1978. He worked in the legal department of a Fortune 500 corporation with international operations, traded on the New York Stock Exchange for 12 years, 8 as its general counsel, so he was a hotshot, with 3 of those based in Paris. A little jealous here. He practiced transactional and School of Law at Langley and Bannock, I probably mispronounced that, I apologize, in San Antonio for 12 years before joining the college district. So here I welcome Ross Lovehead. Thank you. And here's
Thank you very much. You will quickly learn that of everyone in this room, I'm the least trained presenter. However, our Chief Legislative Officer, who is most knowledgeable about all the things that happened at the session, is committed elsewhere, so you get me. It would be the case, though, that concerning the legislation that we have to adapt to, that comes to me as part of a team to roll out compliance and vary policies and procedures. So I will tell you a little bit about what we've been doing there, and then I have a gigantic book from a seminar August 1st, and I have 87 pages of analysis by the Texas Association of Community Colleges in case anyone cares to ask a question about legislation that they themselves are aware of that I haven't focused on. So that will be the approach. I think really what we have here, well, first I'll say, as you all probably know, that every 2 years we get a lot of stuff thrown at us, and there seem to be lots of requirements for lots of reports and lots of policies and lots of certifications that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And this was no exception. What we get is an Appropriations Act that has a lot of content, and it's very important because that's how we get funded in significant part. But at the end of it, then there are all these rules about reports that we're supposed to write. And I'll be honest with you, most of those reports are really supposed to be written by true state agencies in the executive branch. But a little interesting thing to know about state agencies is that the University of Texas is a state agency and Texas A&M is a state agency. These gigantic colossuses are state agencies, but they're also institutions of higher education. So the legislature has the habit of saying state agencies, including institutions of higher education, shall do all these state agency reports. But then they have the habit of looking to the definition of an institution of higher education in the Education Code, and oops, that includes everybody that's not a private school, but a college. So I've often argued that what we're really saying is state agencies, and don't forget the big university systems, becomes state agencies and also us. So we have some fairly detailed reporting that we have to do as a result. So that's why the appropriations bill has a lot of details that we have to deal with. But I would say in this particular session, speaking to a faculty audience, probably the things that you're going to be most interested in are the things that relate to the Faculty Senate, the things that relate to freedom of expression, and the things that relate to remote work. So I'm going in my own amateur fashion to drift through those, and then we can pin me down as appropriate. I'd say the thing that we've been working on the most is the bill about the Faculty Senate, because if we have not done anything, which is now accomplished as of August 12th, had we done nothing, there would be absolutely no representative faculty bodies as of September 1st due to the nature of this legislation. So, we have faculty bodies at each college, we have UFS, we have EFC, we got all sorts of stuff affected by it. So I would say that the thing that we've worked the most on trying to roll out a policy and get ideas about a procedure would be that one. And what we found was the statute was extremely prescriptive. It told us, you can't do this, you got to do that, you got to say that. If you don't, you got nothing. And so this is what we ended up with. Across the college district, we're allowed a single faculty assembly, and it is an advisory-only consultative body advising the administration and the chancellor. And it is made clear that this is how the legislature is now defining shared governance, although it doesn't very much resemble completely what we have considered to be shared governance. And it tells us a little bit about the membership of it as applied to us, because it was written with the big university systems in mind, as is so often the case. A lot of times we get things that we have to do because somebody's mad at a big university system. But we've got to apply it to us, and we're 5 separate colleges. So the way it works is that for the entire district, each college has a certain and equal representation that's determined by the policy which the board has adopted. There will be a single member appointed by the chancellor from each college for each college, and there will be at least a single member elected by the faculty of that college. There can be more. The board started with a recommendation from the administration that there be 4 elected. Faculty, I'll say, presented. It wasn't a formal presentation, but spoke at citizens to be heard with a number of suggestions, one of which was that that number should be increased. The board ultimately passed a policy that said that the chancellor would decide how many would be, but that they would be the same number elected from each college, and it would be at least 4 and no more than 6. So you end up with a faculty senate across the district with equal college representation, and the number would either be 25, 30, or 35. So that'll be rolled out fairly quickly. The statute also prescribes that the chancellor or the administration, the chief executive officer as they frame it in this general legislation, can establish procedures for how the meetings of the Faculty Senate operate to the extent that they're not dictated by the statute. And the chancellor spoke at the board meeting and spoke to the faculty that remained present from citizens to be heard and said there would be interaction with the faculty as he considered how to get that in place by September 1st. The other features that we have of this is that the people that will be voting will be full-time faculty, and also the people that will be serving will be full-time faculty. Particularly as regards service, this was because there would be commitments that would be made and requirements of service that are required by statute to be completely uncompensated. And one of the factors was that the full-time faculty are at least being paid a full-time wage, or salary actually. Anyway, that's where the board ended up, and those were really the only two areas that the board could decide. The board could decide how many people are going to be elected at each college, and the board could decide about effectively the definition of faculty as they applied it. I say again, it's very specific. Another feature it has is that it specifies the terms for the elected. It's a 2-year term. However, the first year, although we'll be electing a full complement, then we'll be drawing lots because they also require that the service be staggered. So the first year we're going to have half the membership on a 1-year program, even though the elections are 2 years. After that, we'll have established the staggered terms, and they will always be for 2 years. It also requires, after 2 years of service, 1 term of the elected. They have to lay out a term of 2 years before they can be elected again. Linda, am I loud enough? Are we good? I should have asked long ago. I can never tell. Okay. And then the chancellor's appointees are for a 1-year term, but they can go on and be reappointed for up to 6 years, and then they have to lay out for a year, and then they can be reappointed again. The presumption is that the chancellor will consult with the college presidents to get a better idea of who he will want to appoint, but the appointive power is with the chancellor. There are a lot of requirements about the meetings. These meetings are not subject to the Texas Open Meetings Act, but a number of requirements derived from that act are imposed on how you do it. It basically has to be streamed and has to be noticed with a specific period of advance notice, and if there are certain actions taken, like a vote of no confidence, those have to be telegraphed in advance. And I believe that this is strictly from memory, but I believe there's a requirement of publication of materials to be considered, at least if it's curriculum or a vote of no confidence, and perhaps in general, published on the website effectively during the notice period. And so it's really going to change how we do things, but we try to get ahead of it, and at least we've got a consultative body and we don't have a gap. And given how specific it all was, I feel like we got done what we needed to get done to avoid the gap, and I don't think tons of judgment was exercised. So that's my 2 cents. This is sort of an important one. If anybody has any questions about this particular one, I'd invite them now before I drone on. Yeah, that's easy. Okay. Not going to do my work for me, huh? That one I didn't have to take out this book or the 87 pages, so maybe I'll be sorry you asked me no questions on this one. Okay, so let's see. The other one, I'll just go into free speech. Actually, it's called freedom of expression or expressive activities on campus. And what we had was several legislative sessions ago, as many of you probably remember, there was apparently the perception that conservative voices were being stifled on campus. So our conservative state legislature passed a bill that was very much promoted that everybody would be heard on campus. And it was extremely permissive, and it broadly defined all the outdoor areas of colleges as a place where people could speak freely and do whatever they wanted. And it followed a lot of the First Amendment of the Constitution about how you can't suppress speech based on the content of that speech, which I think First Amendment scholars, including from the University of Chicago, not coincidentally, would agree with. And it required us to establish procedures so that if someone said that they were being suppressed from the ability to do this, then we had to have an investigative process and all this other stuff. So we duly adopted a policy that got us there in a very, very, very detailed procedure that my esteemed colleague Roxella Cavazos wrote, worked really hard at it. It's several pages long. But in the last two legislative sessions, or perhaps even, I may misspeak because I think the first adjustment was by executive order, so I suppose it was the last 2 years. Our state authorities, I think, did a rethink about it. I don't think they liked what they saw at the Ivies. I don't think they liked the anti-Semitism that they perceived. So we've had to amend this particular procedure twice. First from executive order, because the executive order was about not tolerating anti-Semitism. And so there is an element now in our policy about looking at anti-Semitism that perhaps First Amendment scholars will tell you could amount to a prior restraint on speech based on content. So there may be some tension there, but of course, we're a Texas public entity. We're funded by Texas taxes. We're funded by appropriations from the Texas legislature. And so when we get trapped between the feds and the state, we try and thread the needle, but if there's a problem, we end up listening to the state, and if we get sued, then we may speak to the Attorney General to defend us, which he would probably be quite willing to do. So that was the first adjustment we made to this policy by executive order. Then we had this very significant legislation that came up. The legislation required a lot of adjustments. They're not terribly fundamental, but they're interesting, at least to lawyers. So to fill up my time, I'll tell you about them too. One thing is they really didn't like occupations, and they really didn't like camping in tents, and they didn't really like loud drumming and loudspeakers. And you can sure tell by reading the legislation. So perhaps the most significant thing is that they have encouraged us to narrow the outdoor public spaces to a specific designated space that we consider to be well chosen for the sake of not interfering with our academic primary function, which is probably not a bad idea. And we'll have to do those per college, and we'll have to mark it clearly, and we'll have to be sure that we don't make too small an area, and we'll have to pick an area. Some of this is just me speaking practically. Have to pick an area that would allow for some overflow if we have a big event, so we don't start having to tell people, oh, you have to leave because blah, blah, blah. And so that's really going to be the non-lawyer task, is to pick that out. The college presidents are going to have to figure that out fairly quickly, and I'll be sending them an email this week asking them to do it. San Antonio College is already thinking about it, for which I'm grateful. I got an email from them the other day. But there are lots of other things that we're supposed to do. We're supposed to prohibit camping. We're supposed to prohibit drumming and loud percussive stuff. We're supposed to consider restricting in many, many areas the use of loudspeakers, but we exercised our discretion in our original policy to rule out loudspeakers, so we're just going to stick with that and roll with it. There are certain hours in which people have to be quiet. I think really you got to make your noise between 8 and 10. Then you're not supposed to interfere with the periods at the end of semesters. We have like 1 billion semesters in a certain sense. The thought was maybe people should be allowed to freely express once or twice a year. So I'm drafting with the idea that we're talking about the fall and spring. I think otherwise would be kind of a mess. I think it serves our students that we have all these options, and we don't want to restrict that. And there's certain things that also apply to who is allowed. It used to say that any person would be there. Anybody can come. Well, we saw what happened when anybody came to Columbia, for example. And we saw what happened to the universities that experienced that at the hands of the federal government lately. So they changed that to the university community, whatever that means. But what at least it means is not, people that professionally travel from city to city to raise a ruckus at your campus or someone else's. We can figure out what that means. But anyway, the policy itself has now changed from persons to the university community. The other thing was, I think they decided that they could give more directions to students and employees. So then there's certain things in there that are directed toward enrolled students and employees, ways in which we're supposed to behave. And they're not particularly restrictive or onerous, but one of them is that we can be asked to present ID and we have to show the ID. I guess so they can figure out whether we're outside agitators, as the term used to be when I was in college. But so there's a lot of detailed work. I like to think I've got 9/10 of it done. I have it with review by my colleague Roxella, and then I'm going to roll it out after she gives me her good edits. But it will change things a little bit. I don't think it'll change them a lot, but since freedom of expression is kind of central, it's worth addressing to a faculty audience. It doesn't in any way change what you do in your classrooms. So there's that. Again, would anybody like to explore this or have any questions? Yes, ma'am. I would say only by anti-Semitism, and that was by the governor's executive order, not by this legislation. Yeah, I don't think it really. Yeah, I guess the question was, does any of this really change what I can do in my classroom? And my answer would be no. That the executive order would, that we have in place before this legislation during this biennium interval would require you to suppress the development of an anti-Semitism riff in your class, but not this legislation, and even that's fairly narrow. It's not, it's aimed more at tolerating what was perceived as bad behavior and trying to squeeze down on that than it's aimed at telling you how to teach, which is a plus if we're going to have it. Yay, okay, well, so now we move on to remote work. And this is another thing that reputedly you can thank the big university systems for, because apparently there were some Aggies that were refusing to go back to campus. So So, you know. That's the story. I don't know if it's true, but once again, a big university system is getting a little spanking, and it's reaching our bottoms. So here's how I read it. They don't like people working remote. And I'm not sure how far that goes, but it sure goes to being fully remote all the time. And they're particularly concerned about it with full-time faculty. And there's a lot of rules about, basically they say you can't do it, and then they say except. So, like a lot of legislation, it's not really well written, but I've tried to imagine what a procedure is going to have to look like, so I'll try and give you my perspective from there. They don't really say full-time faculty, but they say faculty members as defined in another element of the education code. When we go to that element of the education code, it's clearly full-time faculty. And then they talk about how anybody that is going to be working remote has to have all these wonderful demonstrated character traits of diligence and being a good employee and able to manage themselves, and the kind of work that they're doing is the kind of work that could be done remotely, and blah, blah, blah. The kind of stuff that really we all should have been that kind of person to begin with, just because we should be good employees, and some of our work, you know, just can't get done remotely. I understand all that, but they put in a law that you gotta, if you're gonna allow remote work, you have to go through that drill about your people before you do. And that applies to everybody. And then we get to the professors at A&M. So if you're full-time faculty, it's going to be very difficult for you to conduct your classes remotely. You're basically going to have to be in the office, and basically even if you're doing online, you're probably going to have to do it from the office. There's some very narrow exceptions related to dual credit that most significantly, I believe, are inclined to exempt high school instructors whom we've qualified as college instructors for the purpose of getting dual credit, getting that college credit element. So we'll see how the procedure rolls out, but that's where it's really aimed. Staff, so much they don't care about. I think, you know, you'll see a lot of people coming back to the campuses more than we have in the past. That's been a gradual process that's been accelerating anyway. I think we'll continue to see that as a matter of management. Perhaps as a matter of details of the procedure, we may see a little of it there, or maybe that's just how we run the place. But there's going to be a lot less remote instruction, that's for sure. That's exactly what they were aiming at here. And again, questions or comments, although it's being recorded, of course.
There was some rumor, and correct me if I'm wrong, that because of this legislation that they would have to clock in and clock out hours that were doing remotely or online. Could we please avoid that?
I don't think it's headed that way. I think it's just going to be harder to do it. But if you're doing it, I don't see it becoming clocked. Now, there may be an idea that there's a certain amount of time that you're supposed to spend during a week performing your job duties. Does anybody else want to comment on that, or we'll just leave it at the moment? We don't have any clocks for you to do it. That's what I thought, but I have to hear it from the source. Yeah. You can try, but we won't know. Oop. Well, glad I didn't spill that yet. This is the 86 pages that's too big to stay on the little tiny ridge, so we're going to put it there. Other-
Yes, I had a question about Senate Bill 412.
Okay.
For those of us that teach classes like anatomy and physiology, we're concerned because we have dual credit students who are minors now, and we show content that is graphic. We talk about human reproduction, we show pictures of genitalia. What advice can you give us to mitigate any risk regarding that Senate bill?
Well, I think if you're doing something strictly biological, you should be fine, right? I mean, they are college students. There's certain times and certain areas in which we need to protect them, but biology is biology, and in fact, the legislature placed quite an emphasis on Darwin biology and other legislation on their favorite boy-girl issue. So I think in terms of the actual anatomy, you'll be okay. I think if you stray into broader discussions of human sexual behavior, you'd probably do better to keep that narrow and not let it go too long. Because, you know, everybody's parents has a different idea of what they're supposed to be taught, and everybody's parents has a different dream of what they think their children are thinking about, regardless of what they are. So that's where I'd be concerned.
Follow-up question, would it be advisable or possible to have the parents sign a waiver saying that they understand that their children might be exposed to that content just as an extra layer of protection for us?
It would certainly be helpful. I think that part of the problem will be whether the logistics of that are feasible. And I guess I could talk to the high school programs people about that. I know there's a lot of paperwork. I'm not sure, though, except for the homeschool, how much of the paperwork that the district or the colleges have actually reaches the parents. But maybe we could, through the dual credit agreements we have with the ISDs, maybe we could put in some requirement that their paperwork, which I'm sure they have to execute to get people into a dual credit program outside of the normal high school curriculum, maybe something could be inserted there. I mean, I think it's a legitimate concern. I just, you know, biology is biology, but it can broaden out pretty quickly. And of course, any parent is capable of raising a little hell with you, and I feel your pain there. Jessica, can we try and remember to talk to Sarah? Thank you. I always like two people remembering when I'm involved. Anything else? Well, there sure are a lot of bills and a lot of stuff we're going to need to be doing, but I really think for a faculty audience, we probably address the ones that are most pertinent to your lives. And thank you for bringing up 412, because that is pertinent to it too. So I'll let class out early. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ross. And again, thanks again to Dr. Brummer for the thoughtful and timely session. I want to thank Northwest Vista and Dr. Bosley, and especially Daniel and his team. They've been amazing. Everything's gone well. So nice to work with, so great to work with. I also like to thank the committee and everybody who's worked behind the scenes to make this possible. It takes a lot of individuals to make this work, so I appreciate each and every one of you, especially you for staying. I know that some of you are online, so thank you also for doing that. I want to close this convocation with just thinking about this new year and the possibilities that we have in front of us. May we carry forward the inspirations of today, this courage to adapt, and the wisdom to lead. and the passion to transform lives through education, always looking towards that moonshot, we have the power to change lives one at a time. That is the power that you have. Use it responsibly. On behalf of the Alamo Colleges District, I wish you all a wonderful academic year, a year of growth, a year of learning, impact, and continued success. Have a great one.